Hey, before anything else, can I ask you a quick favor? Your subscription is what keeps this channel alive. If you've ever felt something from this story or any of the others, or if this channel has ever made your day better, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. It helps me way more than you can imagine. Now, let's get into the story. The first morning, I entered the royal apartments as more than a corridor shadow or a hand that vanished after pouring tea. I could taste the polished silence on my tongue, a flavor like chilled glass and lavender oil. Tradition requires a servant to announce herself with a soft knock and then wait 3 heartbeats, long enough for modesty to rearrange the world if it needs rearranging. On the third, I opened the door and stepped into a room painted by riverlight. Princess Sophia stood by the balcony, half turned toward the gardens, a cascade of pale silk falling from her shoulder like a spill of moonlight caught in daylight. I had seen her before, of course, from the respectful distance demanded by birth and reinforced by the countless eyes of courtiers, but seeing a person at a distance is like seeing a star. You admire cold perfection and know nothing of weather. This morning, she was weather, living, changing, making the air move. My hands remembered their orders before my mind did. Clear the tray, exchange the withered roses, set out the schedule scroll with the punctual lines written by the chamberlain's tidy condemnation. I thought if I made myself the precise clockwork the palace expected, she would become a statue again, easier to serve and easier to ignore. Elena, she said, and my name did not sound like a sounding of ranks when she spoke it. It sounded like a question she was testing for softness. I bowed without looking directly, as the head housekeeper had drilled into me, and answered with a formula, "Your Highness." "They told me you would come," she said, and her voice had that steady clarity that makes people do impossible tasks simply to avoid disappointing it. "They said you are quiet." The oddness of it made me lift my eyes before I could stop myself. Quiet? Perhaps in the corridors where quiet was survival, where a wrong word could become the wrong rumor, which could become the end of employment. But inside me lived an unruly flock of words, 1,000 unsent letters to buildings, to trees, to the river, and now, startlingly, to this woman who wore obligation like a crown only she could see. She was younger than rumor, older than portraits, the kind of person who seems to hold 2 ages at once because one is lived for the world and one is lived in secret. "I try to be, Your Highness," I said, setting the breakfast plate at the edge of the table the way the etiquette primer insisted. "You may speak if you need to," she said, moving toward the table with an unhurried grace that gave everything else permission to slow. "I prefer my attendants to tell me the truth." "The truth," I thought, "is that your laugh last night at the banquet sounded like you were keeping it from running away. The truth is that the portrait painters have not understood your eyes. They paint sky when they should paint water, which can be still, yes, but also deep, also capable of hiding currents that would drown a navy. The truth is that the word promised can be a cage." Out loud I said, "The kitchen sent honey tea. It helps the voice if you must receive much today." "Receive," she echoed after a sip, and the corners of her mouth softened the word until it almost looked kind. "Today we received the princeling of Meridia and his traveling orchestra of advisors. I am to listen to his songs about trade routes." She said it lightly, but the air tightened around the sentence. The marriage had been whispered for months in the servants' hall and shouted in the city with flowers and speculation. The queen called it tradition and safety and treaty. The laundresses called it a transaction with a crown-shaped ledger. I arranged the day's ribbons and combs on the vanity, and because one of the quiet rules of service is to fill a silence before it notices it is alone, I said, "The gardens look beautiful, Your Highness. The wisteria is almost ready to fall." She turned a little at that, the smallest change in angle that nonetheless made me feel as if I had been allowed closer, if only by a finger's width. "Do you tend gardens, Elena?" "I carried water for the East Lawn when I was 12. But I like them best in the mornings when the gardeners have not yet ordered them into polite arrangements." I regretted the candor as soon as it escaped. The palace had taught me that unsanctioned opinions are like mud on marble floors. But instead of closing, her face opened, just at the edges, the way storm clouds open when a wind has the courage to rise. "I like them then too," she said, and there was a secret note in her voice, as if we had discovered a password by accident. She sat, and I brushed her hair because that was the task of the hour, and because my fingers needed a task that would make them forget the shape of her sentences. The hair smelled like rain before it falls, and I told myself this was because the oils were crafted by perfumers who understood the romance of weather. I did not permit myself to imagine the scent belonged to her and would cling to someone's sleeve after an embrace. We are taught the world as edges. This is yours and this is hers. Step on the wrong line, and you will fall a very long way. But the palace is also a city of mirrors, and mirrors do odd things to edges. When the comb snagged on a small knot behind her ear, she winced, a quick crease of pain, and I said, "I'm sorry." Too fast, too earnest. Her gaze rose to mine in the mirror, and for a heartbeat I saw myself as she might, a woman with steady hands, a mouth too ready to apologize for inconveniencing silk, a face that had learned invisibility so well it sometimes wore it like a veil, even when no one asked. "You don't have to be sorry for every twinge," she said, soft, as if correcting an old lesson. "Sometimes things must be felt to be untangled." Perhaps she meant hair. Perhaps she did not. I freed the knot with care, and she closed her eyes as if the gesture were an unexpected kindness. I told myself it was nothing, professional competence, a servant who knew how to be gentle, but the warmth that uncurled in my chest did not obey that instruction. The day unrolled like a ribbon pulled from its spool. I walked 3 paces behind as she moved through lessons and audiences. I listened to plans made about her as if she were an estate to be surveyed, dowry inventories recited with cheerful arithmetic, alliances mapped like trade routes traced with ink across her future. The prince arrived past noon, with a smile that had practiced in mirrors and a voice that had been trained to sound like certainty. He bowed, and the courtiers made that low conspiratorial hum that means a rumor has just become a plan. Princess Sophia did everything perfectly. She greeted, she listened, she delivered wit like an offering at just the right moments to make the air bend kindly. If perfection were a language, she had been born fluent. But when he spoke of Meridia's fountains and festivals, her eyes went once, not long, not enough for scandal, out the window toward the wisteria poised to break into purple rain. I carried notes, refilled cups, vanished, and appeared like a well-timed footnote to someone else's story. Each time she thanked me, the words warmed a thin place in my ribs I had not known was so close to tearing. In the late afternoon, when it is permissible for even royalty to steal a 10-minute space for breath, she retreated to the smaller writing room, and I followed to place the tea and to become again a piece of furniture. "Close the door," she said, and the 4 syllables changed the room's weather. She stood by the narrow window, watching a slice of garden, as if it were telling her something important in a language only the 2 of them knew. "Elena, do you believe in fate?" There are questions on which any answer is a kind of trespass. I chose the one that would keep me safest, or so I thought. "I believe in schedules, Your Highness." She laughed, and the sound was small and unscripted, the sort of laugh a person lets out when no one is scoring it. "Do you?" "I suppose I believe in them, too. They tell me when to breathe." I could have left it there. Servants should leave it there. The next part was a betrayal of caution so small I can only blame it on the hour and the way the light insisted on confessing itself on everything it touched. "Sometimes I breathe off schedule," I said. "When the rain starts and no one is watching." The silence that followed was attentive without being accusing. I looked up and found her looking not through me, as happens when power is bored, but at me with a kind of curiosity that made me remember I had a face and a history before the palace translated me into a uniform. "I have been taught," she said slowly, "that I am the schedule. You are also the rain," I said before I could stop myself, and then my pulse leapt like a bird that realizes its cage door is ajar and regrets it as the cat looks up. Her expression did not harden. It shifted, subtly, like music changing key under the same melody. "You are not as quiet as they told me." "I am when I must be," I said. "And when must you be?" "Always," I should have said. Instead, I told the truth she had asked for earlier, or the portion of it I dared. when words could make trouble that I cannot afford. And yet, she said, you called me the rain. The compliment was treasonous if heard by the wrong ear because it suggested she was more than the shape into which the realm had poured her. I bowed my head, preparing the armor of apology, but she spared me that clumsy metal. Thank you, she said, as if the words could be a warm cloak. Tell me something else that is true, Elena. I stood at the edge of the carpet, one step from where the room becomes hers, and I felt the old fear rise, the one that says everything beyond my station is a cliff with a polite sign. But fear is not the only tutor. The kitchens burn the first batch of almond tarts almost every morning, I said, letting the truth choose a safer costume. The baker says it teaches the ovens humility. She smiled with her mouth and her eyes this time, and the second smile was rarer currency. I would like to try a proud tart someday. I can bring one, I said, then realized what I had promised, and the hours between now and the next morning stretched full of obstacles, wearing uniforms. If it is permissible. You will bring it, she said, with the simple authority of someone who has been obeyed since she first comprehended language, and then, softer, as if balancing the scales of command, please. The clock chimed the end of reprieve, and the world resumed its march. Evening became a banquet, and the banquet became a choreography of forks and vowels and veiled proposals. The prince spoke again of festivals. The queen spoke of duty as if it were a psalm. The candles performed the old miracle of turning wax into time. I did my work, and each time I neared her chair to replace a glass or rescue a fallen napkin, Sophia's hand slipped back from the table just enough that it did not brush mine. I pretended not to notice. My palm buzzed with the ghost of what might have been. After midnight, the halls thinned. The castle is like a person at that hour, its public smile removed, its true bones showing. I carried a stack of linen toward the laundry and past the small door that leads to the gardens. So small, so ordinary, a servant's port for moving plants and tools when the king and queen desire a transformation without witnessing labor. The door was a little open, breathing the damp smell of night leaves. I should have kept going. Instead, because I am not always quiet to myself, I slipped through. The garden under moonlight is not the same place as the garden at noon. Things soften. Rules whisper instead of shout. I stood under the wisteria, and in the pale glow the blossoms were ghost lanterns waiting for the courage to fall. Somewhere a fountain talked to stone. I let myself breathe off schedule. One steady breath until my ribs found a new shape. Footsteps approached then, light and certain, and my heart did that quick double drum that belongs to prey and to people about to be found by the wrong finder. I stepped back into shadow, but shadows are not loyal. They trade secrets for spectacle. Princess Sophia walked into the pergola clearing as if the garden had called her by name. She did not startle when she saw me. Her eyebrow tilted a fraction, which in court is tantamount to a declaration. Elena, she said. The moon patterned her dress with leaves that weren't there. I wondered if you would choose the night. My mouth decided on honesty again, perhaps because there is no audience at that hour except the truth and the vines. Only when the day is crowded. Today was a fair, she said, with the weary warmth of someone who has endured too many stalls selling the same empty trinket. She came closer, not unseemly, not scandalous, just enough that I could see the faint constellation of freckles at her temple that no painter would dare include. You keep your eyes at a respectful level, she murmured, a hint of teasing threaded through the statement. Is that difficult in moonlight? Yes, I said, and then heat rose up my throat at my own bravery, or folly. She looked up at the wisteria, which trembled as if a wind had found it, though the air was still. Do you know why I came? For air, I guessed, because to name loneliness in a princess is to commit a kind of impudence the punishment for which is to be suddenly unemployed. For a place where I am not a schedule, she said quietly. We stood there, two women who by law and story were not meant to share secrets. The night gave us cover, and the flowers held their breath. I do not know whose hand moved first. Perhaps mine, a fraction, in the betrayed physics of proximity, perhaps hers, a less visible shift. We did not touch. It would have been treason to touch. But something passed between us that was not the wind and not the scent of blossoms, something that hummed at the exact frequency of a promise too young to know its danger. "Tomorrow," she said, eyes on the wisteria, "bring me the proud tart." "Yes, Your Highness," I whispered, because whispering was all the courage I had left. She turned to go, then paused with her hand on the edge of shadow. "And Elena?" "Yes." "Not so quiet," she said, almost smiling. "Not with me." She disappeared into the corridor's dimness, and the garden exhaled. I stood very still until the bells far away told me how late it had become, until my bones learned how to be mine again. When I returned to the servant halls, the night maid looked up with the blunted suspicion of someone whose job is to notice out-of-place objects. I had an excuse ready: laundry, a mislaid napkin, but it was the truth that warmed my mouth, that sweet, perilous thing I had tasted for the first time with a princess in a room of morning light. I fell onto my narrow bed when the east began to fade its first gray and dreamed of rain that refused to wait for permission. In the morning, a kitchen boy bumped me with a tray of flawless tarts and swore under his breath about the baker's pride, and I understood that for once the palace had made something I needed without knowing it. Love what you've seen so far and want to help me keep creating these awesome stories on this channel? Then subscribe and hit the bell. Your subscription supports the channel and makes sure you get more exciting stories. I took one, wrapped it in linen, and tucked it into my apron, my hands shaking with the steady tremor of a person who has crossed a line drawn by ancestors and discovered the earth still holds. When I climbed the stairs toward the royal apartments and the day's schedule sharpened its teeth, a pair of guards halted me with a gesture that was more apology than order. "The Queen requests all attendants report first to the Marble Hall," one said. A proclamation. The people in uniforms around me stiffened into attention. I tried to remember how to breathe according to the palace's clock. The Marble Hall is where stone listens to history. The Queen stood on the dais, the prince at her side, the court assembled like jeweled chess pieces arranged for a game no one human ever wins. "The betrothal of Princess Sophia to Prince Alaric of Meridia," the herald cried, "will be sealed at the spring ball, 2 weeks hence." Courtiers erupted into the measured joy of those who know how much enthusiasm is fashionable. The prince looked pleased in the way of men who have never had to want what they are given. I kept my face a servant's face and fixed my gaze on a point of floor where sunlight spilled like a blessing. When I dared look up, just once, I found her across the hall. The world had built a mirror maze around her, reflecting versions of a future she had not chosen. But her eyes found me, narrow as the thread a seamstress uses to hold a gown together at the seam no one is supposed to notice. The look was not a plea. It was not a command. It was a question only the two of us could hear, one that tasted like honey and winter rivers and risk. "Bring the tart," it said. "Bring yourself." And under the thunder of applause and the parade of congratulations, under the weight of a kingdom practicing its favorite ritual, celebrating a promise it will demand she keep, I answered silently with the only truth I had left: "I will." The morning after the proclamation, the palace felt different in ways only those who lived in its bones could sense. The corridors were still polished to mirrors, the banners still hung in perfect symmetry, and the guards still marched in patterns older than their grandfathers, but beneath the surface, the air had a new tension, like a string pulled taut before the bow's release. Courtiers whispered behind gloved hands about guest lists and floral arrangements for the spring ball, about the prince's taste in wines and his rumored fondness for falconry, about the queen's determination to present her daughter as the jewel of an alliance that would shine for centuries. In the servant hall, the talk was quieter, heavier. Marriages in the royal family meant extra work, extra inspections, and no room for mistakes. Mistakes meant dismissal, and in the palace, dismissal was often a polite word for ruin. I carried the tart in my apron as if it were an illegal treasure, its almond scent bleeding faintly through the linen. The baker had outdone himself. The pastry was golden, the filling smooth, the pride unburnt. I felt its weight all the way up the marble staircases to the royal apartments. 2 guards flanked the door, but they didn't stop me. By now I was on the list of faces permitted to pass without challenge. I knocked, counted 3 heartbeats, and entered. Sophia was at her writing desk, quill in hand, though the ink on the page looked dry, untouched. She turned when I approached, and for the briefest moment, something unguarded flickered across her face before she schooled it into the calm elegance expected of her. "Is that?" she asked, her gaze dropping to the parcel in my hands. "The proud tart," I said, and I didn't try to hide the satisfaction in my voice. She gestured for me to place it on the low table by the window, where the morning light made everything look softer, less carved from duty. "You remembered." I said I would. I replied, and her lips curved into the smallest, most dangerous kind of smile, the one that makes you forget how deep the water is before you step in. She took a bite, closing her eyes for a moment as the flavor settled, and when she opened them again, her expression had changed. "You have no idea how rare it is, Elena, for someone in this place to give me what I ask for, simply because I asked." I hesitated, because the truth of that sat between us like a stone we could trip over. "I think I do," I said quietly. "And I think that's why you asked me." Her gaze held mine for a second too long, until I remembered the etiquette that demanded I lower my eyes. She set the tart aside and leaned back in her chair, a trace of mischief in her posture. "I've been thinking," she said, and in the palace, that phrase was both a promise and a threat. "There is something I would like you to do for me. Something beyond your usual duties." My pulse quickened, though I kept my face still. "Of course, Your Highness. Tomorrow afternoon, after the court disperses, meet me in the South Gardens. There is a place there no one goes except the gardeners, and only when the roses are in season. I will have a reason prepared for your absence." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if she weren't arranging a meeting that could ruin us both if the wrong person saw. I wanted to ask why, but her tone warned me that questions might ruin the fragile shape of whatever this was. "As you wish," I said instead. A knock came at the door, and in an instant she was every inch the princess again, her voice cool, her posture immaculate. The queen entered with 2 ladies-in-waiting trailing behind like shadows, speaking briskly about the prince's desire to tour the stables. I stepped back into my place by the wall, invisible once more. Sophia didn't look at me, but as I turned to leave, I caught the smallest flicker of her hand, a gesture no one else would notice, a silent thread tying tomorrow to today. That evening, I passed the prince in the corridor. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and utterly confident, the kind of man who seemed born knowing the world would bend toward him. He nodded politely as I curtsied, but his eyes slid over me as if I were part of the wallpaper. I should have been grateful. Instead, I thought of Sophia's voice saying, "You are not as quiet as they told me." I thought of tomorrow, of the South Gardens, of the dangerous gravity between us. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was counting the hours not to survive them, but to arrive at them. The South Gardens were a geography of absence in late spring, rose canes bristling with patient thorns and a lattice of pale trellises waiting for color, the kind of place the court forgot between seasons because there was nothing yet to applaud, and that was precisely why Sophia chose it. I arrived with a basket of pruning shears and twine borrowed from the gardeners to make my presence plausible, heart beating in a tempo that would have failed any palace metronome, and when she stepped from a column of cypress shade my pulse forgot itself altogether. She wore a cloak the blue of deep water and no jewels. The lac shimmered on her more than diamonds ever could. "You're early," she said, and I could tell from the slight relief in her shoulders that she had been afraid I would be late, or worse, not come. "The gardeners prefer an early hand," I answered, holding the basket like a shield. "I prefer your company," she said, and then, catching herself, adjusted the sentence as if rearranging a bouquet to look less wild. "I prefer quiet before the day demands its performance." We found the little bench under a trellis where last year's rose tags still fluttered, and she sat while I trimmed dead wood that didn't need trimming just to occupy my hands. "I asked you here," she began, eyes on my careful, unnecessary work, "because I cannot be only the schedule, Elena. If I am to be married to a man chosen for me by 100-year-old treaty, I must still know who I am when I sign the page." I need a place, no, a person who tells me when the page is blank and when it already has writing on it. Her words landed in me like seeds. You want a truth keeper, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, as if it had been waiting for this role all along. Someone who remembers you, even when the crown forgets. She made a small sound at that, half laugh, half exhale.
Yes.
And I want to remember you too. Is that permitted? She meant within the rules of the palace, but the question touched a border inside me that rules didn't map. I don't know if it's permitted, I said, and met her gaze because it felt cowardly not to. But I want it. The wind moved through the trellis as if it were passing through a harp, and for a moment the entire garden listened. We didn't touch. We were a breath apart from a dozen kinds of disaster. Still, the space between us felt like a thread that had learned to hold weight. She told me then, in a voice that kept glancing over its shoulder, about the education that had polished her into a jewel. Languages stacked like plates, diplomacy lessons that taught her how to hold a smile steady while hearing the worst, history recited until it stopped being a story and became a cage. They taught me that love is a word for poets, not rulers, she said, watching a gull carve white across the piece of sky framed by the trellis. That affection is to be spent on the populace, not on people. I told her about the opposite education, how to walk without being heard, how to hear without being named, how rage has to learn to dissolve like sugar in tea so it won't be noticed on your face. And yet, she said, the corner of her mouth tilting, you do not dissolve. I want to. I lied, and the lie tasted like fear. She reached toward the basket to rescue a fallen ribbon, and her hand passed close enough to my knee that my entire body translated that almost touch into a chapter. I have a proposition, she said then, and the word proposition in a princess's mouth is a dangerous instrument. Teach me the palace the way you know it. Not the audience halls and ballrooms, but the other country inside the walls. The staircase is used by hands more than by feet in silk. The doors that draft in winter and remind you you're alive. The paths a person takes when they want to be a person, not a portrait. I swallowed around the fact that such a tour could end my service and her reputation.
Why?
Because if I am to decide anything for this realm, I must know the parts of it that never appear on a map, she said simply, and the clarity of it startled me more than any flirtation could have. Because I would like to feel the palace from the inside, not just be felt by it. My agreement was a quiet thing that rang loud in my bones. Tonight, I said, after the torches are lit and the courtiers are too drunk on their own reflections to notice a shadow. Tonight, she echoed, soft as a vow. Footsteps cracked the path like broken ice, and all our bravery folded itself away with the speed of a hunted animal. Lord Chancellor Veller emerged with a ledger under his arm, his mouth wearing its usual expression of polite suspicion. Your Highness, he said, bowing precisely to the degree the etiquette book prescribed, not one angle more. His gaze slid over me and caught, an instant too perceptive. The gardeners have improved dramatically, he observed in a tone that made improvement sound like treachery. I dipped my head, the perfect servant. Sophia smiled in a way that looked like compliance and tasted like defiance, if you had learned her palate. Elena has an eye for small deaths, she said lightly, gesturing at the clipped deadwood. I find it refreshing. Let us avoid larger ones, Veller murmured, then opened his ledger. A note from Meridia. Prince Alaric requests a private tour of the galleries this evening. Sophia's lashes were curtained serenity. Lord Chancellor, ensure the galleries are prepared. I will meet the prince at 8. Then, with a tilt of her head that would be read as dismissal in the language of protocol, she added, and see that the gardeners are permitted to continue their work. He withdrew, and only when the cypress had swallowed him did I feel breath return in full. He suspects everything, I said. That is his profession, she answered, and the sadness in her voice made me want to burn his ledger. The day took us back into its machinery. I trailed her through the palace like a faithful Kalma, and the prince, who did indeed tour the galleries, spoke eloquently about art as property, beauty as instrument, the kind of man who thinks admiration is a form of acquisition. Sophia listened with perfect attention and the gentle, careful no of someone who has learned to decline without moving a muscle. Once, when he stood before a portrait of an old king conquering a very tired-looking coastline, Alaric said, "Power is the only canvas that takes paint," and I saw Sophia's mouth flatten not in agreement, but in a private resolve I recognized as resistance. After the tour, when the palace yawned theatrically into evening, I stole bread and a wedge of cheese from the kitchens and tucked them with a candle stub into my apron. Everything in me shook, but shaking is not the same as stopping. The corridors thinned like hair at midnight, and the torches painted loyal shadows. I waited at the door of the linen room near the narrower spiral stairs that the nursemaids used, and when Sophia arrived, her blue cloak hooded and her steps light, it felt like the building itself inhaled. "Teach me," she whispered, and there was no command in it, only hunger.
So I did.
I showed her the servant shortcut that slipped behind the tapestry of the king's hunt, where the rabbits always looked more victorious than the hounds, if you noticed their eyes. I showed her the little landing that rattled in winter and shook dust from its bones in summer, where the window stuck but, if pried, framed the city lanterns like a necklace made for someone else's throat. I showed her the forgotten chapel that smelled of old smoke and beeswax, where the gods were small and kind and had listened to the laundry girl's prayers long before the court discovered them. In each place, she asked questions no princess was supposed to ask. Who cleans here?
Who fixes this?
Where do they eat? Do they laugh? Do they have sweethearts? I answered until answering became a kind of invocation against the forgetfulness that has always haunted palaces. Once, passing the scullery, we had to press together into an alcove while two footmen staggered by with a barrel, laughing about a card game. Her breath touched my cheek in that sliver of space, warm and close, and the innocent accident rattled every ladder in my chest. "Are you frightened?" she whispered when the corridor cleared. "Yes," I said, because the truth had become the only language I could bear with her. Of Veller? Of the Queen? Of wanting something the world won't allow, I said. And of how wanting it makes me brave in ways I don't recognize. She nodded once, as if I had recited a theorem she had been trying to prove. "I am frightened too," she said. "But I am more frightened of living my entire life as a painting." The last place I showed her was the door that led to the outside of the outer wall, a narrow postern used by messengers and gardeners, its hinge complaining like an old gossip. We pushed it just enough to let in the smell of the river. The city lay beyond like a promise with teeth, bright and dangerous and uncurated. "Someday," she said, not looking at me, looking at the idea. "Will you take me there?" "Yes," I said, and knew the yes was a seed we had both just planted in ground that might never forgive us. We returned by a different route because the palace is a maze that respects those who play it well, and near the laundry I almost crashed into the head housekeeper, Mrs. Darren, a woman whose gaze could polish brass. "Elena," she said, surprise clipped into disapproval. "You've been scarce tonight." "The princess required additional linens," I said, because lies must be woven from threads close to what is true. Her eyes slid to Sophia's cloak shadow at the end of the corridor, too far for identification, close enough to be suspicious. "Mind your footsteps," she said and moved on, but something in her tone made the skin between my shoulders tense. At the door to the royal apartments, Sophia paused. The lamps were low, the carpets swallowing sound. "If I could grant you a favor," she said, "one unrecorded by any ledger, what would it be?" The answer was in my mouth and in my bones, and in every hour we had just stolen. "Time," I said. "More of this." She looked at me as if I had just told her the shape of the future, and perhaps I had. "Then we will steal it," she said, and there was a daring in her that made me think of rivers in flood. We parted with a careful choreography of those who want to be anything but noticed. I slept with my heart in the wrong place in my body, somewhere near my throat, and woke to find the sun had brought with it an order. All attendants to report to the housekeeper's office at once. The corridor hummed with the anxious beehive sound that means news, not joy, and we lined up like thread spools waiting to learn what garment we'd be wasted on next. Mrs. Darren read from a sheet with the crisp relish of a woman whose power is small but well exercised. Effective immediately, rotations to accommodate the spring ball. Assignments as follows. Names and rooms and duties droned until mine appeared, and it was as if someone had opened a trapdoor beneath my feet. Elena of Southgate, reassigned from the royal apartments to the West Wing laundry, night shift, with supplemental duty in the scullery. Replacement to the princess will be Myra, 3rd year. The room didn't move, but I did, inside, falling without falling. I kept my face obediently blank, the way the palace likes its tragedies to look. A few girls glanced at me with that quick sympathetic wince people give when they don't want to catch your bad luck. I counted the breaths it would take to reach Sophia's door and knew I was not permitted any of them. When the meeting ended, Mrs. Darrant's gaze pinned me like a moth. "You are competent," she said, ostensibly kind. "Competence is needed everywhere. The laundry will be fortunate to have you." "Yes, ma'am," I said, because there was no vocabulary for what was happening inside me that wouldn't come out as a scream. On my way to the West Wing, past the window that pretends to be a door, I allowed myself one small disobedience. I slipped a folded scrap of paper under the seam of the tapestry we had used to pass the night, a place only someone who had been there would think to touch. On it, the smallest message I could fit. They moved me. Midnight.
Postern.
If you choose. Then I went to the laundry and fed the palace's appetite for clean cloth with my shaking hands, and every hour struck by the big clock sounded like the word no in a language I no longer agreed to speak. The laundry at night was a kingdom of steam and shadow, its walls sweating with heat from the great copper vats, the air thick with the scent of lye and lavender. It was work meant to numb the mind, feeding linens into boiling water, wringing them out, slapping them onto drying frames. But my mind refused numbness. It was a fever of questions. Had she found my note? Would she come? Was this reassignment a warning, a punishment, or the first step toward something worse? The other women on night shift kept to themselves, their faces pale and damp in the wavering lamplight. No one spoke unless necessary. Here, exhaustion was the only language. When the bell in the East Tower struck midnight, I rinsed the soap from my hands and slipped away, my absence swallowed by the chaos of the vats and the hiss of steam. The West Wing corridors at this hour were deserted, but they still felt watched, as if the walls themselves had taken up the work of the guards. My steps made no sound on the worn stone, but my heartbeat was loud enough to betray me if the walls knew how to listen. The postern gate loomed ahead, its iron fittings dark with age. I slid into the narrow alcove beside it, where shadows pooled deepest, and waited. A cold wind from the river found me, curling under my collar, making my skin prickle with the sensation of being both exposed and hidden. 5 minutes passed.
10.
The doubt began to creep in, that slow, choking whine. Maybe she hadn't found the note. Maybe she couldn't come. Maybe she decided it was too dangerous. Then I heard it, the soft, sure footfalls of someone who knows how to move without summoning attention. She emerged from the darkness in the same deep-water cloak she'd worn in the gardens, the hood pulled low, her breathing a little quicker than her measured steps allowed. "Elena," she whispered, and just hearing my name in her voice loosened something in my chest I hadn't realized was locked. "You came," I said, stepping forward. I would have sooner stopped breathing. Her eyes searched mine in the moonlight leaking through the half-open gate. "Why did they move you?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think someone noticed more than they should have." A flicker of anger crossed her face, not the court-trained kind that hides itself, but something raw, untamed. "Then they will notice this too," she said, and reached for my hand. The warmth of her fingers against mine was both anchor and fire. We stepped through the postern into the outer courtyard, the night folding around us like a cloak of its own. The city lay below, silvered by moonlight, the river glinting like a blade in its sheath. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Somewhere the palace doesn't own," she said, her voice low, almost fierce. We took a narrow path skirting the wall, our footsteps swallowed by grass and earth. Beyond the stables and the royal orchard lay a gap in the outer fence where the vines had overgrown the wood. She pushed through first, holding the branches aside for me. On the other side, the air felt different, freer, unmeasured. We descended into a small copse of trees, their trunks silver and black in the moonlight, until we reached the edge of the river. The water was calm, carrying the reflection of stars like secrets it promised not to tell. When I was a child, Sophia began, I used to dream of running to the river and letting it carry me anywhere but here. I never thought I would come to it like this. I watched her face in the shifting light, how the moon caught the line of her jaw, how her eyes looked darker here, more like night than sky. We can't stay long, I said, though every part of me wanted to. No, she agreed, but made no move to leave. Instead, she let go of my hand only to pull back her hood, her hair spilling free in the wind. But we can stay long enough to remember this exists. Long enough to know we could come back. My voice felt like it belonged to someone braver when I said, I'll bring you again, if you want. She turned toward me fully then, the moon laying its silver hand across her cheek. I do, she said simply, and the space between us felt suddenly, dangerously small. I could hear the river, the wind, the steady rhythm of my own pulse. And then, too soon, a sound from the direction of the palace, the faint echo of boots on stone, deliberate, searching. We both froze. Sophia's expression didn't change, but her fingers brushed mine. Once, quick, electric, as if to say, remember this. Without a word, we slipped back into the trees, retracing our path, the boots growing louder before fading again as we reached the postern. I stepped through first, making sure the corridor was empty. When she followed, she leaned close enough that I could feel her breath against my ear. Tomorrow night, she murmured, not as a question but as a promise. Then she was gone, her cloak vanishing into the dim-lit hall, and I was left with the taste of river air and the certainty that we were moving towards something neither of us could stop. The following day dressed itself in ceremony and called it ordinary. The palace inhaled guests and exhaled instructions. Messengers ran like stitches through a wound. Tables were set and reset to accommodate whims that had never learned to say please. I spent the morning in the laundry teaching my hands not to shake while the vats hissed like displeased cats, my mind working threads into a net that might catch the smallest pieces of hope. There is a rhythm to repetitive labor that can be a prayer or a punishment, depending on what your heart is doing. Mine chose prayer, and each wet sheet heaved across a line was a whispered keep her safe. At noon, a kitchen girl named Lisa slipped into the laundry with a bundle of napkins and a mouth full of gossip. They say the prince is going hawking, she announced to no one and everyone, slinging the linen toward me with more force than necessary. They say the princess will watch, because he wants to teach her how to hold a creature that cannot be tamed. She rolled her eyes, a quick spark of mutiny. As if he knows anything about that. Something fierce smiled in me then, a quiet, unsanctioned smile that tasted like solidarity across class and doorways. I kept it off my face. There are places where a smile is a crime, and the laundry is one if it isn't directed at the right person. By late afternoon, the steam had thinned and our bodies had learned the day's weight. I rinsed my arms in the cooling water and felt the ache like a truth I'd carried too far. A runner from the housekeeper's office arrived with a slate of notices, and my name appeared among rhodas and reprimands. Elena to present herself to Mrs. Darren at twilight. The line carved itself across my ribs. Lisa caught the flicker of my expression and murmured, "Don't borrow trouble," which is a thing poor people say when they've learned trouble rents a room without asking. I dried my hands and went. Mrs. Darren's office smelled of starch and hierarchy. She looked up at me over spectacles that did not need to exist except to add weight to her gaze. "Elena," she said, tapping her pen against a list. "You are efficient. You don't chatter. Until recently, you were invisible. I prize invisible. These reassignment days make visibility more likely. Avoid it." The reprimand came dressed as praise. I knew better than to unwrap it. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes narrowed, tiny knives polishing themselves. A note was found behind the hunting tapestry on the third landing, she said with awful casualness, as if reporting a stain. Blank, as if prepared for a message. My staff are to ignore romance unless it stains a tablecloth, but I am not a romantic. If you want to keep your position, you will stop wandering. The blankness of the note. My note? No, I had written on mine. Perhaps she was fishing. Her stare was all hook. I only go where I am assigned, I replied, stacking obedience into words like heavy plates. She held me a breath longer than comfort, and then returned to her ledger. The Queen plans inspections at random. You will not be caught anywhere that requires explaining.
Dismissed.
I carried my heartbeat down the corridor, each step an echo telling me that walls have ears, and those ears have friends. At the stairwell window that sticks, a slip of paper lay where the frame meets the sill, tucked where a person would find it only if they already loved that stubborn hinge. My name was not written, but the impatient certainty of it was hers. The script was neat and determined. Tonight. The old chapel. After the hawks. I memorized the way the letters leaned forward, brave, hungry, and burned the note on a candle in the scullery because in palaces the only secret paper is ash. Dusk came painted in heraldic colors, the sky gaudy with the kind of beauty that fools you into thinking you are safe because it is. I completed my roll call, carried a basket of folded linens as cover, and slipped into the corridor that curved toward the old chapel. The door still smelled of beeswax and smolder, small gods patient beneath large ones. I entered and found her kneeling at the front pew, not in prayer exactly, but in conversation with the silence, the way a person speaks to a friend who has no advice to give. She rose when she heard me, and the light from a single candle painted her cheek with a brave little triangle. You are seen, she said before I could speak, voice low, clipped by worry. I think Veller said something to my mother. The reassignment wasn't random, it was a test. They are watching you to watch me. The words struck like a hammer hitting a bell. They rang in my bones long after sound died. Then we should stop, I said, and hated how it felt leaving my mouth, like abandoning a child on a doorstep. She looked at me as if I had told her she could live without breathing, and spend the rest of my days learning to be grateful in measured increments. No. She reached for my hands then, and did not take them, stopping just shy as if the air itself were a blade we could cut ourselves on. But we must be cleverer than their watchfulness. The candles sputtered, and the chapel leaned in to listen. Tell me about the hawks, I said when I trusted my voice. Alaric wears a glove and holds lives like ornaments, she replied, a sharp softness that told me she had been magnificent and perfectly polite. He says the hawk's blindfold is kindness. I said nothing and imagined cutting the leather. When I laughed at a joke that did not deserve laughter, I thought of the river. She exhaled, and some of the day's performance left her. I asked you here because I cannot bear to go from being watched as a jewel to being watched as a bride without seeing myself in a place that doesn't want anything from me. This place wants wax and whispers, I said, and dared a smile so small it could hide under a fingernail. It will accept us as offerings. She stepped back one pace and looked around at the small altar, where votive candles had burned for girls who fell in love with stable boys, and for boys who fell in love with soldiers, and for mothers who worried prayers into their aprons. Do you believe these gods listen? I think they remember, I said. Listening is for wind. Remembering is for stone. Then let them remember this, she whispered, and reached into her cloak to draw out something wrapped in a scrap of linen. She unfolded it to reveal a brooch. Simple, nothing like the quartz peacocking, a small oval of dark wood inlaid with a sliver of mother-of-pearl that caught the candle's heart and held it. My nurse gave it to me when I turned 13, before the tutors replaced lullabies, she said. She said I should keep something that belonged only to me. I have worn it under silks and judgments ever since. Now I want you to wear it when you can hidden. So when they move you like a piece on their board, you will carry a square that is yours and mine. Sophia, I breathed, the sound of foolish, holy thing, and within it my own name changed shape, as if her saying mine had given me permission to exist more loudly. If someone sees, they won't, she said, and even if fear argued, Certainty lived in her mouth like a sword's comfortable weight. And if they do, I will make a story that protects you better than my silence would. You can't protect me, I said, surprised to find no bitterness in it, only a statement like any other fact. You can only choose me, and I can only choose you back. Her smile at that carried melancholy and joy as if they were sisters holding hands. Then let us choose. The brooch was warm from her palm when I pinned it inside the seam of my apron, a secret heart against my ribs. We stood there for a while, saying nothing, which is one of the ways people talk when the subject is everything. Eventually Duty remembered our names and came knocking. She needed to join her mother in the audience hall. I needed to pretend laundry doesn't miss hands that are gone.
At the chapel door, she paused.
Tomorrow at dawn, she said, meet me in the Falcon Mews. Everyone will think I am communing with symbols. I will be communing with you. Dawn, I echoed, because even the idea of it made my lungs feel bigger. The mews at dawn smelled of straw, leather, and a clean animal arrogance that didn't bother pretending to be anything else. The birds shifted on their perches, the sound like small armor rearranging itself. A stable boy nodded at me without curiosity. Servants learn to ignore other servants' mysteries because investigating them usually leads to more work. Sophia stood at the far end, half-shadow, one gloved hand resting near a bird that watched us with a depthless golden eye. He told me kindness is a blindfold, she murmured when I reached her, and I smiled. Watch this. She raised her arm, and the hawk stepped up, the weight of it reordering the angles of her wrist and shoulder. There was nothing courtly in the exchange. It was two creatures negotiating weight and respect. I am supposed to keep him hooded until he learns obedience, she said, and her fingers found the tie. But every creature I have ever met learned obedience, with its eyes open. She lifted the hood. The hawk blinked, adjusting to light, and then settled. No chaos, no punishing flight, just a new way of seeing that did not undo him. Do you see? She asked, and I did, though the thing I saw wore different feathers. Her marriage with eyes open, our danger with eyes open, the way love might not save us but might prevent us from being saved into something we didn't want. The stable boy cleared his throat at the far end, a polite intrusion. Your Highness, he called, the Master Falconer, says the prince expects the gray at noon. Duty again, relentless. Then he will have the gray, she said, and the hawk, as if acknowledging the inevitability of princes, bobbed once and returned to his perch. We walked back toward the courtyard through a corridor of shafts of light and hay dust that turned the air into a chapel of its own. Vela has grown more attentive, she said without moving her lips much, the way courtiers speak when they don't want the walls to panic. He asked me yesterday if I had slept well. It is how he says, "Are you behaving?" Does he suspect me? He suspects everyone. It is his religion. We reached the arch where we must part to look like belonging had never found us in the same sentence. Before stepping into the open, she straightened the seam of my sleeve with a gesture so innocent no one would note it, and in that small touch was an entire declaration. I see you. I claim you in the only language we are allowed. The day assembled itself into tasks sharp as knives. In the laundry I became a factory of quiet, but between vats I ran messages on invisible routes. Returning a mended glove to the royal apartments meant passing the hunting tapestry, beneath which I found a tiny folded square tucked into the hem, a map drawn not with streets but with words. Bells, third, east, hush, wisteria. It was a poem of directions that unraveled, delicious and precise, into a plan. At the third bell after sunset, when the east corridor hushes as the changing of the guard stutters, meet under the pergola where the wisteria finally began to fall in purple confetti. Mrs. Darrant's suspicion wore shoes I could hear long before she reached her room. I rerouted twice to avoid her, and once almost collided with Prince Alaric and his chain of advisors, their conversation a clatter of coin. He looked sun-bronzed and pleased with himself, as if the hawks had agreed to become metaphors in his sermon about control. He didn't notice me. The rich rarely notice the hands that restrain their sleeves. At sunset the bell tolled, and the sky arranged itself into theater. I took Linen to the East Wing, because that was the lie my body needed to tell anyone who asked, and slipped through the servant's door into the garden's cooler breath. The pergola was a riot of lavender and shadow, petals loosening their grip in slow motion. She was already there, a silhouette at first, then color and curve. "I thought perhaps you would be early," she said, and there was something strained behind the words, a line pulled tighter than comfort. "I thought perhaps you would not come," I admitted, and felt foolish for confessing fear that had not come to pass. "I will always come until the day I can't," she said, so simply that the truth of it felt like a kiss placed on my forehead by time. We stood close enough to feel warmth without stealing anything the world could name as touching. "I wrote a letter today," she said in a voice meant for leaves. "To the Queen. I told her I would honor the treaty. I asked if the ceremony might be delayed a month to allow the people of both realms a proper celebration." "A month?" I repeated, fastening my hope to that small hook like a drowning person learning a new definition of shore. "What will you do with it?" "Learn us," she said, and the sentence walked straight into me and took up residence. Make a choice with my eyes open instead of letting ritual choose for me. The petals let go, slow as snowfall, and one landed on her shoulder. Without thinking, I lifted a hand to brush it away and stopped an inch from silk and skin. The air between us crackled with how much it wanted to be a bridge. She watched my hand the way a person watches a precipice they know they will eventually leap from. "Elena," she whispered, and my name was an invocation. "If I ask you to meet me outside the palace walls, will you say no?" "I will say yes and then learn how to live with what it costs," I answered, because truth had become the only language I trusted with her. "Tomorrow night," she said, fearless and trembling at once, "the river ferry at the market pier after the moon clears the tower. We're something that looks like anyone's." "You want the city," I said, imagining her face ungoverned by portraits, street lamps doing worship the court had never learned. "I want to walk where a woman might be just a woman," she said, fierce and soft in the same breath. A twig snapped near the hedge. It was nothing, a fox, a leaf, but terror wore the same shoes as foxes in palaces. We sprang apart into the choreography of strangers, and in that exact beat Lord Chancellor Veller stepped into the clearing with the expression of a man who has discovered a misfiled document and intends to correct it with relish. "Your Highness," he said, too affable, eyes taking a quiet inventory of petals and proximity. "You are difficult to find in the evenings. The Queen wondered if you had retreated to your devotions." Sophia's smile was a weapon made to look like a flower. "I was admiring the wisteria," she said. "It reminds me that beauty does not ask permission to change." Veller's glance flicked to me, sized me, and placed me in the category he uses to store tools. "Elena," he said, naming me with bureaucratic ease that made the hair rise on my arms. "Your diligence is applauded. The laundry gleams. See that your diligence remains in its appointed rooms." I dipped my head, the portrait of compliance. He turned back to Sophia. "The Queen would be comforted to see you before supper." "The Queen will be comforted," Sophia said, and for a heartbeat I saw the Queen's daughter, not the realm's instrument, a woman who could promise comfort and deliver steel. Veller withdrew like a tide that intended to return stronger. When he was gone, the night did not sigh. It braced itself. "Tomorrow," Sophia breathed, her mouth barely moving. "Tomorrow," I answered. We left the garden separately, 2 lines in a poem deliberately misaligned so the censors would miss the rhyme. Back in the servants' corridor, the world resumed its customary hunger. Lisa caught my sleeve as I passed the kitchens and pressed a folded bundle into my hands. "From a friend you don't have," she said with a grin that told me she suspected danger and decided to be on its side. Inside, a plain gray cloak, a kerchief, a pair of soft shoes with city dust already in the seams. "They're my cousins," Lisa whispered. "She won't miss them tonight. Don't make me ask questions I don't want to know answers to." I hugged her because there are moments when breaking a rule is the only honest act available. Midnight learned our names again, and the palace tried to hold them in its mouth. I wrapped myself in the gray cloak and slipped through the postern with a confidence I did not feel. The market pier smelled of fish, smoke, and 1,000 stories piling on top of each other until they became a city. The ferry was a moonlit plank with a man attached, his beard honest, his price low. Sophia arrived 3 breaths after I did, hood pulled, posture practiced into anonymity. For a blissful half-minute we were no one. We boarded, and the river took us, with the indifference of large old things that have seen kings and lovers pretend at permanence. Midway across, voices drifted from the opposite bank, men laughing, the tin clatter of a dropped pail, and then, behind us on the palace side, a shout. The ferryman stiffened. My blood turned to bells chiming alarm. On the slope above the pier, torches moved like small angry suns, and a voice I recognized as Vellers called orders that sounded like nets thrown into water. The ferryman cussed softly in a dialect older than either of our realms and bent to his oars like a man rowing away from a prophecy. Sophia didn't look back. She met my eyes in the half-light, resolve bright as a drawn blade, and said, not loudly, but with a kind of joy that made fear blink, "We were always coming to this." The ferry slid into shadow near a tangle of warehouses, and the torches on the palace bank hesitated, counting possibilities. The ferryman hissed, "Off, quick," and we scrambled onto a dock that smelled of tar and freedom. We ran, not like ladies or servants or symbols, but like bodies that wanted the horizon. And as we darted into a narrow lane where the city held its breath and prepared to either shelter us or sell us, I realized the cliff I had been approaching for days was under my feet, and we were midair. The city at night was a tapestry of smells and sounds so rich it felt almost dangerous to breathe it in, as if the air itself might change me. Smoke curled from braziers on street corners, carrying the scent of roasting chestnuts and spiced meat. Lanterns swung above narrow lanes, their light spilling in restless patterns across cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Somewhere close, a musician coaxed a mournful song from a fiddle. Somewhere farther, a drunk sang along to something only he knew. Sophia kept her hood low, but her stride was unhesitating, confident in a way that made me wonder just how often she had imagined this. "Where are we going?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Somewhere I can see the city, without someone explaining it to me," she replied, and there was a fierce, almost giddy note to her tone, the kind I'd only heard when she was speaking of wanting more than the palace walls would give. We wove through the market district, now mostly shuttered, but with enough lingering merchants and street cooks to keep the place alive. A woman with arms dusted in flour handed us each a small loaf without asking for coin. Whether she didn't recognize Sophia or chose not to as a kindness, I didn't question. Sophia bit into hers with a grin that made her look younger, almost unburdened. "I've never been given anything without a speech attached," she said around the bread. "I'm not sure I know how to thank her properly." "Eat it," I said, and she laughed softly, the sound dissolving into the night like steam. We turned into a side street that led uphill, the buildings leaning toward each other as if conspiring. I followed her past a row of shuttered shops, their painted signs faded and chipped, until we came to a wooden stair clinging to the side of a warehouse. She climbed without hesitation, and at the top we found ourselves on a flat roof. The city spread out below us like an unrolled map. From here the palace was just another shape on the skyline, its towers softened by distance. "It's smaller from here," she said, standing at the edge and looking toward it. "Everything they tell me is too big to refuse, it's all smaller." I stepped beside her, and the closeness felt like the roof's true edge. "And the city?" "Bigger," she murmured. "More alive. More mine." The wind tugged at her hood, and she let it fall back, her hair catching the lantern light in threads of gold and shadow. I watched her watching the city, and I realized she didn't just want freedom. She wanted to belong to something that wouldn't try to own her. We stayed there until the wind carried the first hint of dawn, and the rooftops began to silver. But as we turned to leave, the creak of the stairs below froze us both. A man emerged, a dockhand by the look of him, broad-shouldered, smelling of brine and ale. His eyes slid over me without interest, then stopped on Sophia. "You're a long way from where you belong," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut. "I belong where I choose," she replied, steady, though I could hear the care in her voice. He laughed, not kindly. And what would the queen pay to have her little jewel back, where she can keep her eye on it? I felt Sophia tense beside me, and before I could think, I stepped forward, placing myself between them. Walk away, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. He looked me over, amused. Or what? Or you'll find out that the palace isn't the only place with eyes, I said, bluffing harder than I ever had in my life. For a moment I thought he might call it. Then he spat to the side, muttered something about not getting paid enough for trouble, and disappeared down the stairs. Sophia exhaled slowly. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, I said. Because I'm the one who brought you out here. Her gaze softened, and something unspoken passed between us. Gratitude, maybe, but also a deepening of that dangerous thread that had been pulling us together since the first morning I stepped into her rooms. We made our way back to the dock in silence, the first light of morning brushing the water in pale gold. The ferryman from the night before was gone, replaced by a younger man who didn't ask questions as long as the coin was right. By the time we slipped through the postern gate, the palace was stirring with the first rush of servants starting their day. In the narrow corridor that led toward the laundry, Sophia stopped me. Tonight was, she trailed off, searching for the right word. Ours, I offered. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips.
Ours.
And not the last. But before I could answer, footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. We stepped apart, the practiced distance sliding between us like a veil, just as Lord Chancellor Veller appeared, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. He looked at Sophia, then at me, and said in a voice that made my stomach twist, "The Queen will see you both.
Now."
The Queen's private audience chamber was a room built to make truth feel smaller, high windows that admitted light like judgment, a floor of inlaid wood so polished it seemed unkind to stand on it, and tapestries that illustrated old victories in which no one bled. Guards flanked the door, not the ceremonial kind but the kind with their hands resting easily near steel, and Lord Chancellor Veller waited to one side with his ledger, like a second mouth. The Queen sat beneath a canopy of pale silk that framed her not as a mother but as an institution wearing a woman's shape. Prince Alaric lounged at an angle that suggested he regarded thrones as furniture rather than altars. Sophia stepped forward first, graceful and unhurried, and I took my place 2 steps behind and a little to the left, where servants become punctuation and no one reads them aloud. Daughter, the Queen said, and the word softness was all in the front. The back of it was iron. You are up with the washerwomen this morning. Dawn is a persuasive tutor, Sophia replied, voice even. It teaches what daylight assumes. Veller cleared his throat, a sound like a drawer closing. Your Majesty, there is a matter of timing. The princess's early stroll coincides with an increased need for prudence. We have received 3 new letters from Meridia. Their eagerness should be matched. He did not look at me when he said stroll, but the word brushed my skin like a cold hand anyway. The Queen studied Sophia as if reading a book that had learned to write back. Lord Chancellor says you are difficult to find at night, she said mildly. I dislike losing what belongs to the realm. I do not belong to the realm, Sophia said, and the room brightened with the audacity of it. I belong to myself. I serve the realm. Alaric's mouth shaped a little O of interest, amusement flickering across his eyes like light on water. I kept mine on the diamond pattern of the floor and practiced being air. Service, the Queen repeated, tasting the word. And what form does your service take when the halls are dark? Learning, Sophia said. Understanding what is asked of me beyond the choreography of receptions. The people are not marble, and neither am I. Veller shifted, displeasure arranging his shoulders. Your Majesty, the princess's curiosity has begun to generate rumor. There were torches at the postern last night because certain shadows stirred. The Queen's gaze slid to him the way a sharp knife slides back into its sheath, efficient warning. Rumor is your profession, Veller, but not your master, she said. Then, to Sophia, you asked me yesterday to delay the ceremony a month. I am prepared to consider it, on conditions. The word conditions landed in the room like a stone in a pond. Even the tapestries seemed to rustle. "Name them," Sophia said. "1," the queen said, and lifted a finger adorned with a ring old enough to have outlived 4 lines of fashion. "No more unsanctioned journeys. If you wish to listen to the city's heartbeat, you will do it under watch that I choose. 2, public appearances with Prince Alaric will double. This realm will see a future and volunteer its faith. 3, I appoint a liaison to carry petitions from the commons to your desk each morning to remind you who you serve. That liaison will also report to Velar." At that last, her eyes rested on me in a way that made my spine fret about its own existence. "Elena," the queen said, my name transformed by the sealing into something ceremonial, "you are to leave the laundry. You will serve the princess as reader of petitions and recorder of replies until the spring ball." For a heartbeat, I believed I had misheard. The floor's pattern wavered like heat. My pulse ran to the brooch hidden in my apron seam and knocked there as if it could be let in. "Your Majesty," Velar said with lawyerly silkiness, "the staff of the Chancery is trained to, and trained to comfort me rather than inform me." The queen interrupted, "No heat, only fact. Commoners write with their blood under their fingernails. I want someone who still remembers what blood is." Her gaze returned to me. "You will be watched. If I sense impropriety, the west gate opens and does not close behind you. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty," I said, and my voice did not shake, which felt like a small, hard-won miracle. Alaric shifted forward, interest sharpening into something else. "This is unusual," he said, sounding not disapproving so much as intrigued by a new rule he might someday exploit. "It is necessary," the queen answered, and that was the kind of sentence that ended conversations. "You may go," she added to me, with a tilt that signaled dismissal without disdain. Sophia did not look at me as I backed out because looking would have said a dozen things that rooms like this reuse as weapons. In the corridor, my breath returned in pieces. Lisa waited at the turn like a message that had learned to walk. "I heard," she whispered, eyes wide with a cocktail of fear and triumph. "Reader, recorder, saints chew on me, that's close as a servant gets to a son." "Or a flame," I said, and she swallowed, understanding. "Then don't blister where they can see," she advised, and vanished down the service steps before advice could turn into shared guilt. The Chancery offices smelled of ink, parchment, and the particular fatigue of men who believe their handwriting keeps the world obedient. A clerk with eyebrows like hedges looked me over as if I were a stain walking upright and shoved a stack toward me. "The day's petitions for the princess," he said, as if the words made me unclean. I carried the stack to the small anteroom off Sophia's study that would be mine for the month. A narrow desk, 2 shelves, a chair that had never learned comfort. The first petition was from a widow whose roof had caved. The second from a potter whose kiln had cracked because the alderman cut wood allotments. The third from a boy of 12 writing a careful, misspelled plea to spare his sister from indenture after their father's fine. "Blood under fingernails." I read until the words blurred. Then I copied summaries in a hand the tutors had never trained, but which work had made decent. At the second bell before noon, Sophia entered, 2 ladies-in-waiting trailing, and my heartbeat performed a treasonous dance that I killed with a look at the floor. She sat, the ladies hovered like midges, and I, reader, read. My voice told her the city in the only language allowed in that moment. Roofs, kills, indenture, bread. She listened like a mountain listens to weather, immovable and yet altered by every gust. "Reply," she said at intervals, her tone a measured instrument. "Have the steward send timber. Ask the kiln master to assess and repair at crown expense with a note from my hand. Bring the boy and his sister tomorrow. I will hear them." Velar slid in silently halfway through, took up a lean by the window, and cultivated the expression of a man who disapproves of gravity. He said nothing until the end, when he observed, "Benevolence breeds expectation. Expectation breeds unrest. Hunger breeds unrest faster," Sophia said calmly. His mouth thinned into a single line, and I saw, for the first time, fear in him, the fear of a world that refuses to be legible to ledgers. After the session, the ladies-in-waiting wafted away to report nothing disguised as something, and Sophia and I were left with a thin privacy that hardly deserved the name. She took a breath as if she were stepping off a ledge and said, "Do you see what my mother is doing?" "Keeping you busy enough to be visible," I said, "which is a way to keep you too busy to disappear. And keeping you near enough to be watched," she added, eyes flicking toward the door where Veller had recently been. "So, we will become excellent at saying everything in plain sight." "We need a code," I said, and the sentence felt like a hand finding another in the dark. Something to string through what everyone expects to hear. "Petitions," she said, and her smile lit from underneath. "Margins. If I ask for more ink on a reply, it means not safe. If I ask whether the paper is too heavy, it means meet me where we met the gods. If I underline a date twice, it means river. And if I fold the top corner of a petition inward, I offered, it means I am frightened, but not by the thing written. If I fold the bottom corner outward, it means I am followed." "Yes," she whispered, and it was not a plan so much as a vow. We practiced once like children playing at spies and then returned our faces to the masks that help people survive palaces. The afternoon ground itself into obligation. Alaric appeared at the third bell, all gleam and gilt, and requested Sophia's hand for a stroll in the West Gallery, which is where dynasties go to speak in half-truths, watched by ancestors who always approve of conquerors. "You look thoughtful," he said to her as their steps echoed on stone, and I, 3 paces behind, became air again, a vehicle for ink and silence. "I am," she said. "I am considering the shape of a month. It will be a bright one," he said with the way of men who have hired the sun in their imagination. "Your people will adore a wedding." "They will adore bread," she answered, gentle, precise. He looked at a portrait of a queen who had been loved only by history and said, "Power is bread." "Power is a knife," she returned. "It can cut bread or throats." His laugh was good-humored and empty. "You will be a fascinating queen," he said as if describing a horse with interesting lineage. "And you a competent king," she replied with a smile that eats itself to avoid wounding. After he peeled away, Veller ghosted up at my shoulder without sound. "Reader," he said, the single word patting my roll like a cat backward, "you hold much paper for one pair of hands. Paper burns. So do hands." "Then I will be careful," I said, and the calm in my tone surprised even me. "Do," he murmured. "It would be unfortunate to find you unfit." The rest of the day I felt his attention like a draft through a window you cannot locate. At dusk, a petition arrived that did not belong. Its seal unmarked, its edges too clean, the script too careful in its attempt to look like a commoner's. It complained of a broken lantern in the East Ward and requested a repair on a date that did not exist. The details were wrong in ways that felt intentional, like a riddle rather than a grievance. At the bottom, where most petitioners add a blessing, the scribe had written, "Like the tower that watches no one." My skin prickled. When I brought the stack to Sophia, I placed that one last and folded the top corner inward. She read quickly, lips barely moving, then touched the page as if it might bite. "The watchtower by the old bell," she said aloud for the room to hear, bland as tea. "Ask the steward to have a look." Her finger pressed the margin twice near the false date. "Not safe." After the session, as I turned to gather the papers, Alaric appeared again as if conjured by his own entitlement, and Veller materialized behind him, his smile thinner than a blade. "Reader," the prince said lightly, trapping me between conversation and rank, "walk with me." It was not a request. We moved into the small anteroom, and the door closed with a heavy suggestion of privacy. Up close, he smelled of spice and expensive confidence. "You have the queen's favor for the moment," he observed conversationally. "Unusual for someone whose hands know soap better than ink." I said nothing because sometimes silence is not deference but armor. He studied me, then smiled in a way that was meant to be generous. "I reward loyalty. Serve the princess well and discreetly, and perhaps when you tire of laundry and ink, Meridia could employ a woman with such resourcefulness." I always find uses for eyes that see what others miss. I serve the crown here, I said, careful. I see only what the petitions tell me. He said, and tilted his head. Eyes like yours see more than paper. Consider this. Kingdoms are safer when their jewels are admired rather than stolen. He meant Sophia. I heard the theft he feared and desired. I am no thief, I said, and he chuckled low. Everyone steals something, he murmured. Time, glances, breath. Just be sure what you steal doesn't cost you your hands. He left me with that, and re-entered the study wearing diplomacy, like a cloak. I stood for a moment until my heartbeat learned stairs again. When I stepped back in, Sophia was signing 2 letters and leaving the questionable petition conspicuously aside. Our eyes met for the barest instant, and that was enough to remind me the room did not own our language. At the last bell before night, my orders took me past the East Corridor and its mute sentries. I drifted with a basket I did not need to carry and watched the tower that watches no one, a stub of stone with a rusted bell that no longer rang for fires, only for practice. A shadow moved there, a figure too still to be a guard, too patient to be a drunk. The false petition had been a summons. To what? To whom? The tower's stare was a spiral as tight as a heartbeat. I should have turned back. I should have delivered the message to Sophia and waited for a safer hour. But the hook the note had set tugged at something old in me, the part that did not want to be a painting or a ledger entry or a ghost in someone else's room. I climbed. The top chamber was open to the sky on 3 sides, the 4th a wall scabbed with old notices nailed by hands who never imagined they were building an archive of fears. The city stretched below, inked and breathing. At the far edge, a man leaned against a parapet with an ease too perfect to be harmless. He turned as I stepped out, and the first thing I registered was not the face, though it was handsome in that way coin can purchase from fate, but the ring. Meridia's crest, bright even in poor light. Prince Alaric smiled, and the smile had shed its pleasant, public weight for something lighter and far more agile. You read more than petitions, Elena, he said, the false petition lying like a snake on the stone between us. You read rooms. You read people. That is a talent. I prefer talent on my side. My mouth felt dry in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the new shape the danger had taken. You sent the note, I said, because naming things can sometimes drag them into a light that tames them. Veller penned it, he said lazily, with the generosity of a man who credits the artisans who make his threats. But yes, I called. I prefer to speak with those who influence princesses without appearing to. I carry paper, I said. I empty vats. And you take a princess to rivers and roofs, he replied, and my blood cooled until it was an intelligent thing. I am not a jealous man, he went on, easy, confiding, but I am a practical one. Your closeness to Sophia is useful if directed, dangerous if not. So let's arrive at a clarity that saves us both from uglier clarity later. He moved closer by one civilized step, the distance still proper and poisoned. Keep her compliant. Encourage her toward the month's end with grace rather than grief. Steer her away from flights that become scandals. In return, I will ensure your continued employment. Here until the wedding, in Meridia after. Comfort, safety. Perhaps even a small house to anchor your dutiful life. The word dutiful slid over my skin like oil. And if I refuse? I asked, surprised at how even my voice sounded when my heart had begun to pound a war drum. Refusal is a word that often precedes correction, he said pleasantly. Veller is eager to find a pretext to remove you. I have discouraged him thus far. My patience is not infinite. Why not tell the queen what you suspect? I pressed because if I had to die on this tower, I wanted to do it informed. He shrugged, elegant. Because the queen respects Sophia too much to believe she could be foolish. She believes in duty like she believes in dawn. If I accuse without proof, she will ask why a prince without a ring on a finger thinks he owns a princess's evening. I prefer to earn the ring and keep my hands clean. I am offering you a way to keep yours. He meant, be my spy. He meant, put your love in my service, so I can put hers in my pocket. He meant, help me build a cage, and I will make you a keeper instead of a bird. The wind lifted a piece of paper and plastered it briefly against my ankle. When it fell, I could breathe again. Sophia is not a jewel to be catalogued, I said softly, because I could not bear to speak that truth loudly in his presence. She is a storm. He smiled, indulgent. Then I will build better roofs. Sometimes storms wash roofs away, I said, and his eyes cooled another degree. Think carefully, he advised, half turning as if the conversation were an entertainment he was willing to abandon. You are a small piece on a large board. But small pieces topple queens, and save them too. Choose your direction. You have until tomorrow's second bell to give me an answer.
Do not make me seek you.
I dislike chasing. He left with a courteous dip of the head that made mockery of every bow I had ever given, and I stood there with my hands clenched so tightly a crescent of nail dug into my palm. The bell above me, which had not rung in years, gave a tiny, complaining shiver in the wind, as if remembering its vocation. I descended into a corridor that had learned to smell like secrets. At the stairs' bottom, a figure detached itself from shadow with the care of someone who has made a profession of it.
Veller.
His ledger was not with him. He had brought a different tool. That thin smile. The prince is generous, he said conversationally, as if we were discussing a surplus of sugar. I am not. There is no bargain from me. There is only arithmetic. If you jeopardize the treaty, I trim the equation. By what? I asked, because sometimes you need to stand inside a threat to learn its shape. Dismissal is too simple, he said. You would find another house, another uniform. I prefer solutions that remove the variable. The West Gate is convenient. The river is an efficient collaborator. He said it like a man reciting inventory, and bile rose in my throat because I believed him. Then perhaps do not drive people to rivers, I said before I remembered that courage and suicide share a fence. His eyes brightened a fraction, as if he had found a note of spice in a dish he had expected to be bland. Ah, he murmured. There you are. He inclined his head. Good night, reader. May your reading keep you orderly. When he was gone, I pressed my palm to my chest until I felt the brooch through fabric, a small oval of wood and pearl reminding me that I belonged to myself and to the woman who had given it. The palace rearranged itself around me as I walked, disappointed that I had not crawled. In the anteroom, the false petition waited with the patience of threats. I folded the bottom corner outward and slid it beneath the day's stack for morning. The mark would tell her I was followed. The paper would confess that the prince had begun to move like a man building a stable for a storm. I slept in pieces, my dreams full of bells that would not decide whether to warn or celebrate. Before dawn, I rose and carried my fear to the kitchens, where fear becomes bread if you knead it long enough. Lisa caught my wrist when I reached for flour I had no right to touch and shoved a mug of bitter coffee into my hand. You've got the look of someone who saw the wolf and put a ribbon on it, she muttered.
Drink. Don't die.
If you die, I'll have to fold twice as many napkins. I laughed, quick and broken, and the sound stitched a tiny wound closed. At first bell, I placed the stack on Sophia's desk with the outward folded corner peeking like a tongue of flame. She entered with the calm of a woman who has decided not to bleed in public, and we practiced being made of wood while people stood around to admire the grain. When they left, I moved my finger over the false petition's edge and said, in the blandest tone I could forge, a curious note about the East Ward. The date seems inventive. She read it, her face a geography of self-control, and tapped twice against the margin. Not safe. Aloud she said, ask the steward to assess the lanterns, and then, under her breath, tell me with your eyes. I did. I told her about the tower, about Alaric's offer dressed as rescue, about Veller's arithmetic with the river, and I did it all without words, because there is a way lovers speak long before they are allowed to name what they are. My throat tightened, her inhale shortened, my hand flattened on the desk to remind myself what was real, her gaze cut to my palm, as if it were a book someone had told her not to read. Tonight, she said finally, shaping the syllables for the room, but inside them lived another sentence. We must choose. There is a rehearsal in the grand ballroom, she continued, loud enough for the walls to pretend interest. We will review the opening procession. The code slid between us like a ribbon we could pull if the world tried to tie us elsewhere. Rehearsal meant witnesses. Grand meant danger. Procession meant a path, with an end anyone could see. I nodded, and somewhere in my chest a door I had not noticed before swung shut and locked because the time for wandering had ended. I had until second bell to deliver an answer to a prince, and until night to find a way to not become a piece on anyone's board. When the second bell struck, the corridor outside the anteroom smelled of wax and fresh rushes. I stepped into it and nearly collided with Alaric, who must have been listening for the bell as if it were a signal invented to honor his patience. Well, he asked lightly. Clarity. I looked at him and remembered the roof, the river, the hawk settling with its eyes open, the way Sophia had said ours and put the word inside my bones. The palace waited for my obedience, like a mouth open to be fed. No, I said, and the word tasted like honey and steel. No, he repeated, pleasantly baffled, as if I had declined an extra cushion. No to your bargain, I said quietly. No to your house. No to your leash. I will not shepherd her into a cage. She will make her own choice, not yours and not mine. For a second, a thin, honest anger flashed across his face, the first true thing I had seen there. Then he smiled the way a man smiles when he decides a sport will require a sharper knife. Very well, he murmured. Let us all be free, then. He stepped aside with courtly grace, but the corridor felt narrower after he passed, as if he had stolen even some of the air. I did not watch him go. I went back to my desk, to petitions about roofs and kills, to ink that sometimes stands between a boy and a chain. All day the palace arranged its finery to rehearse for joy. All day the walls tasted the future and tried to guess its flavor. And when night came and the orchestra tuned to a key that sounded like a held breath, I stood at the edge of the grand ballroom and understood that every path we had taken had led us here, to a floor designed for spectacle, to a crowd eager to be shown what to believe, to a choice that would either save us or teach us how to drown beautifully. The grand ballroom was an ocean of gold and glass, every surface polished until it could drown you in your own reflection. Chandeliers dripped light like honey from 100 candles, and the marble floor gleamed as if it had been laid for the sole purpose of carrying important footsteps. The orchestra played something elegant enough to disguise its purpose, a rehearsal of movement, of hierarchy, of the story the court wanted to tell. Sophia stood at the center of it, wearing a gown the color of midnight before rain, her posture a study in poised defiance. The queen and Veller watched from the dais, and Alaric lingered just far enough away to appear casual, but close enough that his presence was a constant pressure. I held the petitions in my arms like a shield, though everyone knew they were only paper and ink. Reader, Veller murmured at my shoulder. You will observe. You will not participate. I nodded, my eyes on Sophia, who glanced toward me once as she began her procession across the floor. It was a dance, though no one called it that, an arc designed to place her beside Alaric for the final bow. They moved in practiced steps, but something in her rhythm was off. A fraction too slow here, a glance over her shoulder there, the tiniest rebellion disguised as elegance. When the music paused for adjustments, the queen gestured to a cluster of courtiers, drawing their attention away. Sophia's eyes found mine across the ballroom, and the smallest tilt of her chin told me to move. I obeyed, without knowing the destination, circling the edge of the rehearsal until I reached a side corridor draped in velvet to hide the service door. She slipped through first. I followed, the music muffling behind us. The corridor beyond was narrow and dim, lit only by a single wall sconce that flickered as if nervous to be the only witness. She leaned back against the wall, the midnight fabric of her gown pooling like shadow around her, and for a moment we simply looked at each other, two people who had been forced into speaking in margins and were suddenly in the center of the page. You said no to him, she murmured, her voice carrying something between gratitude and fear. I said yes to you, I replied before I could think better of it. She exhaled, a sound so quiet it might have been mistaken for relief by anyone who didn't know her. They will try harder now. So will we. The space between us was barely more than a breath, but it was the most dangerous ground we had ever stood on. I could hear the faint echo of the orchestra through the wall, a reminder that the palace's story was still being told without us. Elena, she said, my name tasting like a decision in her mouth. We might never get a moment without eyes again. Then we take this one? I said. And before fear could dress itself as caution, I stepped into her space, my hands finding the edge of her sleeves. Her fingers came up to my face, tentative at first, then certain, and the contact was enough to undo every careful wall I'd built around wanting her. The first kiss was not the desperate kind I had imagined in quiet moments. It was slow, deliberate, like reading the first line of a book you know you'll never be able to put down. Her mouth was warm, her breath steady, and the world outside that corridor ceased to exist. When we broke apart, the air between us felt charged, the flickering sconce suddenly brighter. Now it's real, she whispered, as if she'd just signed a document that couldn't be burned. It was always real, I said. Now it's just undeniable. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor, pulling us back into the urgency of where we were. She straightened her gown. I stepped back, petitions clutched to my chest like an alibi. We returned to the ballroom separately, her rejoining Alaric's side as if nothing had happened, me slipping back to the perimeter, where Veller's eyes narrowed just slightly, the way a man reacts to a scent he almost recognizes. The music resumed, but my pulse still moved to the rhythm of her mouth on mine, and I knew the palace had just become a far more dangerous place for both of us. That night, the palace was quieter than usual, the corridors holding their breath as if they knew something had shifted. I felt it too, in the way my chest ached with the memory of her mouth on mine, in the way every shadow seemed sharper, more alert. I worked through the petitions with deliberate care, but my mind kept drifting to the corridor behind the velvet curtain, to the taste of her and the unspoken promise in the way her fingers had lingered on my cheek. At the first bell after midnight, I slipped out of my chamber under the pretense of fetching more ink. The postern gate was locked, Veller's subtle tightening of the leash, but I didn't need the river tonight. My feet knew where to go. The small chapel was empty, its air cool and still, the candlelight trembling in its glass. I didn't wait long. Sophia arrived with her hood down, her hair loose, her eyes holding the same restless heat I felt in my own bones. They're watching me closer, she said, voice low but not timid. Even the ladies-in-waiting report every glance I give to the wrong person. And now I've given them the right one to fear. She stepped closer, the flicker of the candle catching in her eyes. I'm not sorry. Neither am I said, and the truth of it settled between us like something we could stand on. But they will use it against you. Then we give them something else to look at. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. This is the schedule for the spring ball rehearsals. I've marked the places where no one pays attention. 2 nights from now, we can leave without notice for almost an hour. I took the paper, my fingertips brushing hers, and that single touch felt like an echo of the kiss, gentle but impossible to ignore. Where would we go? Somewhere the palace doesn't own, she said again, and the way she repeated those words felt like a vow. I studied her, the boldness in her posture, the stubborn hope in her tone, and I realized she was already building something inside herself, a plan, a future that didn't bend entirely to the crown. I wanted to stand inside it with her. A sound in the corridor made us both tense. We moved apart just as the chapel door opened, and a figure stepped in, Lisa, wide-eyed and breathless. The Queen's Guard is looking for you, she told me. They say you're needed in the chancery.
Now.
Sophia's expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. Go, she said softly. I'll see you in 2 nights. I left, the parchment hidden in my sleeve, my mind already calculating the path to that hour of freedom. But as I entered the chancery, Veller was waiting, alone, his ledger closed on the desk like a sealed verdict. "Reader," he said smoothly, "your work brings you very close to the princess. Close enough that the court notices. Close enough that I notice." He rose, the movement slow and deliberate. "Tell me, what exactly do you intend to do with that proximity?" I met his gaze, forcing my voice to stay even. "My work. Nothing else." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "We will see." He waved me away, but as I turned to leave, I knew this was no idle warning. Something in his tone promised that whatever we did in those stolen moments, the walls would try to follow. And in 2 nights, those walls might finally catch us. The spring ball unfolded like a performance staged for the gods, silks in every color that had a name, music threaded through with the clink of crystal, and the careful choreography of alliances pretending to be joy. The palace was ablaze with candles and expectation, every shadow inspected, every smile recorded. From the dais, the queen shone like a figure carved into the idea of power, and beside her Alaric stood as though the night already belonged to him. But Sophia moved through the room with a quiet defiance, each step measured, each glance calculated. I followed at the prescribed distance, petitions long since set aside for the evening, my mind fixed on the folded parchment hidden in my bodice, the one marked with the hour and place we'd been planning for 2 days. At the 4th dance, when the room's attention was on the whirling couples, Sophia glanced toward the far balcony and gave the tiniest nod. I slipped away under the pretense of carrying a message, weaving through the crush of gowns and gold until I reached the service corridor. Moments later, she emerged from the opposite door, her gown whispering against the marble as she joined me. "We have 40 minutes, she said, breath steady, but eyes alight. We moved quickly, down familiar hidden stairs, through the tapestry passage, and out into the cool night air of the South Gardens. The wisteria pergola was nearly bare now, petals carpeting the ground in faded purple, but the scent lingered, heavy and sweet. Beyond it lay the postern gate, and beyond that, freedom. The market pier was alive even at this hour. Lanterns swinging above stalls, the air thick with spices and roasting meat, laughter spilling from taverns. We walked quickly, cloaked and hooded, until the noise softened behind us and the streets narrowed into the quiet of the old quarter. There, at the edge of the river, we found the small stone steps that led down to the water's edge, a place hidden from the main road by leaning warehouses and ivy. The moon was high, its light spilling silver over the river. We stopped there, breathing in the quiet. "If we keep walking," Sophia said, "we could take the ferry to the other bank and keep going until the palace is only a shadow behind us." I searched her face. "Do you want that?" "I want you," she said simply. "The rest, we can decide together." My chest ached with the truth of it, with the impossibility and the beauty of what she was offering. "If we go back now, it will be harder," I said. "They'll watch every step." "Then let them," she replied, and there was steel under the softness. "They can watch us walk together." The decision was there between us, a fragile and brilliant thing, and I realized I had been moving toward it since the first morning I'd stepped into her rooms. I took her hands, pulling back her hood, so I could see her fully in the moonlight. "Sophia," I whispered, "whatever comes, I'm with you." She smiled then, not the polished curve she gave to courtiers, but something unguarded and fierce. "And I with you." The kiss this time was nothing like the first. It was not cautious or stolen. It was certain, a seal pressed onto the shape of our choice. Her lips were warm, her fingers threaded into my hair, and the world beyond the river vanished. When we broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine. "This is our vow," she murmured. "Not the one they've written for me. Ours." We stood there until the sound of distant bells pulled us back to the urgency of a night. We returned the way we'd come, the city still humming behind us, the palace waiting like a lion in the dark. But something had shifted, inside us, between us. We were no longer moving through the palace's story. We had begun